You're making money, getting sales, clients are happy, you are moving and grooving, but that bank account is running on fumes. And paying yourself is unfortunately more of a luxury than a regular occurrence. If that sounds familiar, yeah, you're not alone, my friend. I hear this so often from so many business owners, and it doesn't seem to matter what industry they're in, how long they've been around, or even how big the business is. This is a common issue that affects tons of businesses. So, today I'd really like to talk to you about my profit prescription and show you three real businesses where I was able to diagnose the core problem and prescribe the cure to fix what ailed them. You ready to get right on into it? So am I. Let's head on in. So, who am I? My name is Sarah Bryson. I am a CFO. I've worked with a bunch of different businesses over lots of industries, again, ages, sizes. And what I find is it really does not matter. All businesses experience the same sorts of issues. It's just a matter of figuring out what the issue is in each business so we can tell them exactly what they need to do to fix it. Here is something that happens a lot is I talk to business owners and they're like, "Hey, I've already got an accountant. I've already got a bookkeeper. Why would I want to talk to a CFO? What's so different about it?" Well, because your accountant and your bookkeeper are amazing at history. They take a look at everything. They make sure you are in compliance with everything that has already happened. They're taking a look into the past to make sure that it complies with regulations. That's awesome. We love that. We want them to be doing that. But what the CFO's role is not looking at the past. We are looking into the future. And what we need to do is not answer, are the numbers correct? Are we in compliance? But instead, is this business working for the owner, for what they want to have? Is this a financially resilient, profitable business that supports you, your family, your employees, and your community? That's what's important. That's what really we want for every single business. And that's not something that accountants and bookkeepers are typically going to look at. But as CFO, that is what we do all day, every day. So let's talk about our first profit prescription. And this was a residential cleaning company. I had known the founder for a very long time, and I knew a lot of the troubles that they were facing. And it was a residential cleaning company. It was a partnership. You had two owners working together. And the main problem was, even though they'd been around for a while, the business was profitable, right, on paper. They found themselves having a lot of financial issues. In fact, the founder of the business, one of the owners, was having to work a full-time job on top of running the business because the business couldn't pay its own bills, definitely couldn't pay her bills. So if she wanted to have food on the table and keep this business afloat, she had to work this other job. And she really didn't want to. She just wanted to work on the business, but she had to keep putting her own money into the business to keep it working. And they had a feeling that they probably just needed to sell more, which is very common. Most people think, hey, we just need to sell more, get more sales, figure out what it is that is going to make this business better. Many people default to selling more. They tried to get their costs under control, but they thought their costs were absolutely beautiful and perfect. So let's take a look at that and see what we find in their numbers. So here were their numbers in their books. And this is a really interesting situation because if we take a look right here, hey, can't beat that, right? Like you're under 10% for your cost of sales. That's amazing. And even with their revenue, more sales coming in, more sales, more money, hey, they actually brought their cost of sales down by a percentage. That's killer. And their gross profit, what they're keeping after their initial cost of sales, and really clearly, cost of sales is the cost to provide what you sell to your client. So that's going to be everything that goes into providing that. And that's important to note because here we see we've got a great one, but there was something very interesting is when we were looking at their cost of sales, and I want to be clear, their books were correct, but they had never factored in wages for their cost of sales. It was just hanging out in the payroll, which is totally fine and totally correct when it comes to financial reporting purposes. But when we're actually taking into account looking at not just reporting purposes, but actually figuring out how much you need to be charging for your business, that picture is going to change. We need to start factoring in labor if that labor is needed in order to provide what it is that you sell. And in this case, it absolutely was because they had people going into the homes providing their direct labor to produce a clean home. Well, we needed to keep that in mind. And what happens is when we add that in, I want you to keep an eye on this over here. Look at how this changes. Oof. Yeah, so we dropped significantly. And in fact, you can see over here, no wonder she needed to have that extra work. She needed to have that job because how are you going to cover those costs if it costs more in your labor than it does for what you're bringing in? And looking at this, it became extremely clear why they were having so many issues paying their own bills, paying the business's bills, because wow, labor's expensive and they just hadn't taken in enough money. They didn't have the right charging in place. So when it comes to them, their profit prescription was pretty simple and pretty clear just from looking at these numbers and factoring in labor to those costs. And another thing that we uncovered in having these conversations is not only were they not charging enough to cover all of their cost of sales and have a decent amount of money left over after that, because remember that money left over, this 23%, this $34 from every single job they were doing, that had to cover everything else. It had to cover their utilities, had to cover rent, had to cover office supplies. And remember, owner pay. How's an owner going to pay themselves if you have so little left over? The other issue we discovered is they were discounting because they wanted to get more sales. They had a two-person team that they were starting to run. And that two-person team, in order to get people to pay for it and buy it, they were running a discount. But when we ran through those numbers, well, guess what? Their costs were actually doubled for each of these services. They had double the fuel costs because the people going out to do this two-person team, they each drove in individual vehicles. You, of course, have double the supplies because you have two people using the supplies. You had double the labor wages. So when it came to the end of the day, there was no real profit being made from that because of the discounting. And that is something I see happen a lot. Is discounting is not always fantastic. It's usually pretty ouchy, pretty painful. So, what was their profit prescription? Well, for this particular business, we needed to properly classify the labor in the cost of sales. Again, not has to be a change to the books. Don't have to make any changes in the books. We just need to factor that in our pricing. We need to make sure that we understand our true costs, which were actually closer to 70%, in fact, over 70%, pretty close to 80%. It wasn't under 10%. This new person was doubling, but pricing didn't reflect that. And then when we had the discount, it was already compounding that damage. So their ultimate prescription, honestly, it was $19.42. Yeah, how wild is that? If they could increase their average sale by just $19.42 per sale, then that would be enough money to be able to have the business cover its own costs and have enough left over for the owners to start paying themselves enough of a wage that they wouldn't have to work a full-time job on top of running the business. Pretty wild, isn't it? But that's all they needed was this $19.42 change. At the core of every business owner, we just want one thing, and that's a business that supports our family. But too often we find ourselves struggling just to keep this thing alive. And that's a situation we see with our next client. Is you see, he was working his tail off, struggling. I mean, he had sales, lots of sales, he had happy clients, but he just couldn't seem to have enough money to support his family. And even though it was a multi-million dollar business, for some reason, he kept finding himself using today's jobs to pay for yesterday's bills. And he was living on lines of credit, and he'd already tried pretty much everything you can think of. In fact, I have this thing I call the core four, and it's the four reactions I see almost every time a business has really tight money. And what those are cutting our costs, pushing our sales, delaying paying our vendors, and taking on debt. He'd gone through all of them. He'd done absolutely everything he could possibly think of to try and get this business to provide the life that he wanted and to do what a business should do. So let's take a look at what's going on with his business when I gave him his profit prescription. So, one of the first things that I always take a look at is what are we seeing in our numbers, right? I've listened to what's happening. I can hear the concerns and I can hear things that have already been tried. But what are the numbers telling us about how money is moving to and through the business? And in this situation, we can see that, our costs don't look to be that bad. I would love to see, a little more money left over. Of course, that's always ideal, but these aren't really bad numbers. But you can see right away, we've had this huge drop year over year in how much money is coming in. And the average money that we keep from each of those sales has plummeted. We've got like $12,000 less, and that's going to hurt a business. It doesn't matter what size you are. If you're losing that much money, that's going to hurt. So, first is we want to take a look at this and I want to know, well, why is that? Where's money coming from? And where is money going to? And in here, I noticed that, wow, those marketing expenses are actually extremely low. How are people finding out about you? Because if you have marketing and your marketing is 0% or 1% of all the money coming in, well, there's something going on here. So, what's going on? And you know what? We had a conversation about that. And the conversation told me that, well, the majority of people who are getting me business are builders in the area. They're saying, hey, if you want me to build this for you, you got to go to this other guy and he's going to be the one to design it. Oh, interesting. Well, tell me more about that. What we found out is that for every one of those referrals, he was giving them about a 5% referral fee. Oh, very interesting. So if we're doing a 5% referral fee, it would make sense for us to add that into our marketing because that's really how he was marketing. And look at the difference. We went from, say, about 65,000 to over 300,000. And that's a big deal. If you've got a multi-million dollar business, jumping that much is huge. Even though it's only 5%, that's still really important to your business's bottom line. So let's take a look at if we factor in those referral fees, just so that we can see how much less money we're going to have at the end of the day. And wow, that's quite a bit less. We originally thought that we were working with, about 59% for every sale we had, but in actuality, we had 54%, right? We have this 5% that's always going to be gone. The other issue that we discovered as I was asking more questions was, you know what? The original owner of this business, because recall, this is someone who purchased an existing business, the previous owner had never paid themselves. And they were the main designer. And well, you know what? That's a big cost to the business. So when he came in, he was already taking over a business that had numbers that weren't really accurate to what he was actually taking on, unless he wanted to take on a business where he didn't pay himself. Don't know many people who make that choice. But that was our main issue with his business and how we can fix it. And so by fixing that, we're looking at is 5%. Just factoring in this 5%, when you do your estimates, you bump it up by 5%. And guess what? That was what he really needed. That was going to get him that extra cash flow to have enough money that he could pay himself. And not only pay himself, but he could afford to have his wife retire early. What a dream, right? Who doesn't want that for their family? 5% to get a business that actually works for him and gets him the life that he's always dreamed of. Miscommunications and misinterpretations. Think about how often that affects our personal lives. Well, guess what? It has an effect on your business as well. And with our next client, we're going to be taking a look at exactly how that played out for them. So, with this client, they're a marketing company, and they came to me super proactively. I was so stoked because they had 30% growth in a single year without doing any extra marketing. Amazing, right? So I was super excited. They wanted to know exactly what their numbers meant because they didn't get into business in order to read financial reports. They got into business because they were amazing at marketing. And one thing they also wanted to understand was the positive impact of hiring additional staff. So they had, for the first time ever, done W-2 employees. Before they just had people who were contractors. Now they were hiring W-2 and they wanted to see the positive impact on those hires for their business. Understand that, really get a good understanding of their financials, what their numbers look like, what they were doing so that they could plan and move forward. And I was super stoked. And the first thing I thought was, well, boy, howdy, you've had a 30% increase. Let me take a look at that. And so I started taking a look at their numbers. And well, what did I see as I was getting in and taking a look at their numbers? The first thing was that I didn't actually see a 30% increase. I saw a decrease in revenue. Well, that was interesting. Wonder what's going on with other numbers. Did they have an increase in how many sales they had? No, they didn't. Well, did they have an increase in the average value of each of those sales? No. So, what we've actually seen all the way down is a decrease. And to show you that, if they had had a 30% increase in sales, they would have gone up to 304. But instead, you can see how few they had comparison. And on top of that, this is what their revenue should have been if they actually had that 30% increase. So interesting. What's going on with this business? And that was exactly my question is what is happening in this business to make him think that he's had this 30% growth when the numbers show the opposite? They've actually had a decline. And I found out because he had mentioned hiring this new staff, taking on new people, that he had actually opened an entirely new division within his business. And what had actually happened was he'd taken on more work, and the workload and all the extra stress and so much more that he was doing felt like a 30% increase, but not actually a 30% positive increase to his bottom line. It was really overall a reduction in how many sales, in the value of each sale, and the money that was coming in. He just had a whole lot more work that was going on. So, okay, let's talk next about the people that you hired because, hey, that's important, right? We want to understand how is it impacting you? And here's how it was impacting him is his payroll had increased costs by 10%. Now, that's okay with me. I don't care as long as we're seeing a good impact. We're seeing a good return on that. So, how do we make sure that we have that good return? Because I'll be honest with you, as soon as he saw this number, he wasn't very happy. He had no idea. And part of that is because when you switch from doing contractors to W-2, there are a lot of extra costs you've got. You've got everything from workers' compensation, extra taxes, the whole shebang. You've got benefits and everything. And those are all part of the cost of payroll. And so he was really shocked at this number that it was so high that it was 10% of everything that was coming in was going to paying payroll. And I said, hey, that's cool as long as we're getting a great return. So talk to me about these people because you mentioned that you weren't really sure. And in having this conversation, well, it turned out the reason that he wasn't really sure is he didn't really know what they were doing. He'd hired them because he knew he needed people to support more things, or at least he thought. And so he was kind of just hoping that they would figure out what needed to be done, but that wasn't how it worked out. So I said, hey, you know what? This is what I think you should do is go in there, have conversations, figure out what it is they're doing, figure out what will help your team, benefit your team, move your team forward. And then from there, you can take a look at everything and see what changes you may or may not need to make. We do really want to take a look at these numbers and understand the overall impact of not just what was happening with payroll, which was significant, but oof, when we're also factoring in how little money is coming in, the fewer sales, the lower average sale value, and yes, we add in this payroll expense, we've dropped by like 12% in how much money we can keep at the end of the day. And that doesn't really help your business. Now, if these are great investments that are absolutely necessary to move the business forward, right? You're investing in future growth, totally cool. But that's not what I was hearing from this particular owner. And he thought about it, and we just had to have that conversation that 30% growth wasn't really reflected in the numbers. It was down. Staff had come in because of false growth. He couldn't tell me what the new employees were really helping with, and that's okay because now he understood his numbers. He knew the real story of what was going on, and with that, he got his profit prescription. And this was it. It was just stop, look, and then grow. Pay attention to what your real numbers are really telling you and have those hard conversations. And that was really what it was, is for him, he had to have a conversation. He talked to all of the people working within his business so that they could tell him what would actually help them make their jobs easier, make the work go faster, help with communication. And what happened at the end of the day, because I checked back with him a few months later, was hey, you know what? We found so many ways that they could actually help. And we gave them these new job duties. And unfortunately, they weren't really a cultural fit because they weren't willing to jump in and do these duties. And so we wound up having to release people because they weren't actually a good fit. Not only were they not really doing what we needed them to do to support the business, they weren't really cohesive when it came to the culture of our business in general. And so we wound up releasing them. Oh, and also our team is getting on so much better because they've been talking. They've found all kinds of different ways to make the business more efficient, to get things done faster and easier. So we had a super big benefit because not only did we immediately get that 10% back when we discovered that this wasn't going to work out, but we also wound up in a much better situation with higher efficiencies and happier team members. Total win win, right? So, what I really want to talk right here about is these were three totally different businesses, different industries, not really a whole lot in common, except that they had some pain points. And that's kind of how a profit prescription works is it's not a set it and forget it, one and done, just give this pill. And you wouldn't want a doctor to do that, right? You would want a doctor to listen to you first, run some diagnostics, and then prescribe that prescription that's custom for you. That's exactly how any prescription should work. And so, even if you have similar symptoms, you may have very different solutions, very different things that you need to do for you and for your business. So, now that we've seen how profit prescriptions have worked for other businesses, what could this look like for you? Well, the main things that I see across the board, no matter what actually is happening in the business or what the prescription actually is we're usually fixing five big things. Is number one is you're finally able to pay yourself. Most owners never build their own pay into pricing, for example, and that's something that I find regularly and fix it. Another great thing with fixing that is when you start taking off those hats, because let's be honest, you're a business owner, you wear every single hat under the sun. But as you grow, you need to start taking off those hats. You need to have somebody taking over different parts of the business. If you're charging appropriately, then you're able to do that. You can automatically afford to hire the right people to do the right jobs and still pay yourself. We also help with your cash flow. You aren't going to be struggling month to month, wondering, am I going to be able to make the bills? Because you have that cash flow that's regular and reliable. You have that pricing that covers all your costs, including ones that you might not be looking at day to day, but are real and need to be accounted for. I find places where we're bleeding money and where it's just pouring out of us month after month, and we had no idea that was happening. Well, we can find that. We can fix that. And finally, we build that business that supports your life because that's what it needs to do. You need to be able to live the life that you want to live. You shouldn't live to work. My goal today was simple: to show you what's really possible when you stop guessing and start looking at what your numbers are actually telling you. And if these three businesses taught you anything today, I hope it's this: the problem is almost never what you think it is, and the fix is almost always simpler than you'd expect. So here's my question for you: what's your $19.42? What's your 5%? What's that single conversation? What's the one thing hiding in your numbers that could change everything? If you're ready to find out, I'd love to help. And it's just a simple conversation. The link is going to be down in the description. You can also use this QR code. Just click it, boom, and you can set up a conversation with me. Totally free, easy peasy, right? And I'm not going to give you vague advice. I'm not going to give you a generic fix. I'm going to look at your actual numbers, listen to your real pain points, and I'm going to give you a real answer, a real prescription to fix it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Go forth and profit, everybody.